Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman. Nice to see you, Patrick.
Nice to see you as well, Leonard. And so we have another illustrious, great guest. I'm so proud of all the guests that we've had on this show, but this is another great one. And so why don't you make the introduction and
Yes.
bring him on?
Yeah, Richard Wolff is someone we've been trying to get on the show ever since we started, and we're really proud to have him. He's an American economist, one of the most prominent critics of modern capitalism, founder, managing member of Democracy at Work, host of Economic Update. He's a professor of economics at the New School and probably some other universities as well. The author of several books, including Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. So welcome, Richard Wolff, professor. It's nice to see you. Thank you for coming on.
And thank you for having a program like this. It's very much a pleasure and an honor to be part of it.
Thank you. Let's start out, since you're the first economist we've had on the show, let's talk a little bit about the US economy. And I want to focus on a couple features of the US economy. One is the fact that our dollar, the US dollar, is a reserve, what they call a reserve currency. This seems to be a very important factor. It's certainly our leaders think it's very important, and I know there's talk that we would go to war if there was any threat to our reserve currency. How important is this? The other thing about the reserve currency is it allows us to print money, which other countries cannot do, which I guess is a good thing, but it also allows us to accumulate a lot of debt. It allows us to fund wars that are not necessarily in the interests of the American people. Right now, I think our national debt is something over 37 trillion. I'm old enough to remember when politicians pretended to care about the debt. And there was talk, well, it can't go above this number, then we'd have a problem. Or if it goes above GDP, we're going to have a problem. So let's start with that. Is this a problem to have $37 trillion of debt? When does it become a problem? Does it not matter since we have a reserve currency and can just keep printing money? Help us out with this, Professor.
All right, let me try to do that, and let me do it by putting it in a certain historical context. The dollar has not always been the reserve currency that it was over the last 75 years and that it is today. The reserve currencies have been varied, and mostly they've depended upon whose economy was the big one. So, for example, before the dollar became the global reserve currency, the British pound played that role. There was a period of time where the Dutch currency played that role, and so on. In the old days, when we've had previous empires, it was typical for whatever the empire of the time was, the Greek, the Roman, the Persian, the Ottoman, that the currency of the key country running the empire became the currency that played the kind of reserve role. The second thing to keep in mind before we jump into the specifics is what you mean by the term reserve currency. Every country has to have some sort of backing for its currency. In other words, if I'm doing business with Malaysia or Nigeria or Bolivia, and they offer to pay me in their local currency, my willingness to do that or not is shaped by how secure I think that currency is. How safe is it to accept payments? I wouldn't want to accept payment in Bolivian, whatever they are, only to discover the next day when I went to do something with those Bolivian pieces of currency, nobody would give me anything for them because they had no value or they had lost their value. So it's a very powerful thing to have your currency backed by something that gives it value. And of course, through most of human history, that has been gold. Well, what a country has is a store of gold, and for us, we keep it in Fort Knox. And actually, but in Fort Knox by the tradition. And that's a backing that people know that under extreme circumstances, the United States has gold to get it through troubles with its currency. None of that, however, distracts from the fact that what mostly determines the value of a currency is what people believe it's worth. Very much a question, and that's true of the United States as well. Yes, we have the gold. Do we have to give up the gold in exchange for dollars if people want to cash them in? No. What is then the value of the dollar? It depends on the conditions of the American economy relative to the rest of the world. But in the rest of the world, things are shakier, and everything's changing now. It used to be, for example, in the 75 years since the end of World War II, the United States was the dominant global economy. The US dollar was its currency, and banks around the world kept dollars alongside gold to show the world that it was safe to deal in their currency. And under extreme circumstances, they would have to give up gold for their currency if the rest of the world were not willing to hold it. So the United States got a very interesting benefit out of the decision of almost everyone else in the world to hold dollars as a reserve. So let me tell you what the benefits were, and then briefly why the countries did it. Here's the most important benefit. If the United States is going to fight a war anywhere, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran now, if you're going to fight a war, you have to pay for it. And wars are always expensive. So then the question is, how do you pay for it? And it's like everything else the government does, since it's governments that do wars, the government has to either raise taxes to get the money to pay for a war or to borrow. And here's the political problem. Any war that would be financed by taxes would mean that the president, say, of the United States, would have to go on radio and television and say to the American people, well, I've decided to go to war in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or now Iran. And to pay for it, we're all going to be taxed. So I'm sorry to have to tell you that I'm taking another $5,000 from every American family to pay for it. Well, if you think we've had opposition to our wars before, you can imagine what kind of reaction we would have if people understood that they were going to be out of a hefty chunk of money to pay for a war. Therefore, we don't pay for a war with taxes. We pay for a war by borrowing money. One of the reasons our national debt is now about $40 trillion is because the United States maintains 700 military bases around the world and is fighting one or more wars almost continuously. And that has cost a fortune of money and has led the government to borrow because politically it's much too dangerous to tax. And because of the dollar being a global currency, because everybody is looking to have some of it, uses it. In a minute, I'm going to explain what the key use of it is. There's always an interest in having dollars. And one of the ways you get a dollar is if you sell something to the United States, and the United States pays for it in dollars. And the dollars go overseas to whatever country sells us import. And then they have to decide what do they do with the dollars that they got in payment for what they sold us. Well, many of them keep the dollars. They hold them in their banks as reserves because it's the global currency. And that means we in America get yet another privilege. We get the fruit of real labor, the French wine, the Japanese electronics, the oil, whatever it is. And what do we give in exchange? Cheap green pieces of paper that have printed on them US currency. It costs us nothing to produce that currency, but it costs them real inputs, real labor to produce all the goods that we pay for with dollars. Now, last point, and if I'm taking too long, be sure to feel free.
Could I just interrupt for 1 second? Because isn't there a third way that we pay for things like wars besides raising taxes and borrowing money? Can't we also just print money? Isn't that a third way?
Yes, but that's under borrowing. The way that works is here's how that works. The United States Treasury runs a deficit, so it borrows money, and it issues what are called Treasury securities. It literally prints up what is an IOU. The government owes you, whoever buys such a treasury, a certain amount of money which will be paid back to you at the end of a year or 5 years or 10 years, and that has an annual interest rate attached to it. As soon as you get it, you being a bank, an insurance company, a corporation, or just a wealthy individual, wealthy in the sense you have enough money to lend to the government, which most citizens don't. But if you are rich enough, you too can lend to the government and acquire a treasury security. But here's what is important for you to understand. There are banks and other financial entities who do that and who then immediately, and I mean often within minutes, sell the treasury they just got, that treasury security from the United States government. Who do they sell it to? They sell it to the Federal Reserve System. And where does the Federal Reserve System get the money with which to buy the security? It prints it.
Okay.
It calls up the U.S. Mint and it says, roll them. And then the money gets literally produced, and the Fed gives that money to you or me in exchange for buying the treasury. But this complicated system, because you might be wondering, and if you were, you'd be a good student of economics, you might be wondering why this complicated system to print money. And the answer is, and this is very important, the history of the human race is a history of countries whose sovereigns, whether they were kings or elected officials, systematically abused the printing of money, got themselves out of one political jam after another. For example, wars, by printing money like crazy to solve a problem, and then that produced a terrible inflation and caused all kinds of economic and political havoc. The result of that was to create this complicated mechanism so that you'd have to have the Treasury and the Federal Reserve cooperating. And so the hope is they wouldn't do as crazy things as might have been done if the president alone had the right to do this. And given our current president, I think most economists would tell you they're very happy that we have barriers before he can simply call up the mint and tell them to run the money. Now, there are problems with money that's always associated with debt. It means that when the government borrows money, it may have in its mind simply to pay for some particular activity. But it is also, by doing so, creating the possibility that those Treasury securities will be converted into new demands for money, which the Federal Reserve will honor. And now you have to worry about inflation here in the United States because you may print more money than there are goods and services that can be purchased with that money. So now, finally, let me tell you, why is the dollar a reserve currency beyond wanting to secure your the security of your own currency if you're a foreign country? And the reason is, as all of these things are, very, very political. There's nothing automatic about an economy. All of its institutions, money, the corporation, the market, those are human institutions. They all have a history. That means if you go back in time, you will find plenty of examples where they did not exist. They had to be created. Human beings did that, and they did that with all the problems and all the failings that they created any and all institutions that we have around us. Well, here's a wonderful example. Back in the early 1970s, the United States discovered, because in those days, the dollar was not yet the universal currency that it became. It was on its way there. With the end of World War II, the dominance of the United States made it a safe bet that eventually it would become the global currency, but it wasn't there yet. The British pound still played that role, even though it was clear that the British Empire was fading away. And in that circumstance, in that moment, the United States was still backing its dollar by gold. And one of our allies, General de Gaulle of France, whose economy had recovered from World War II, decided during the 1960s that he didn't want to hold dollars. That wasn't a thing everybody did yet. And Mr. de Gaulle was a big patriot of France. So he took the dollars that came into France from people who bought French wine, from people who went to France as tourists and unloaded money there. The dollars accumulated by the central bank in France, they announced they didn't want to hold them. They demanded gold. And because we were on what is called the gold standard at that time, the United States had to literally ship bars of gold in huge quantities to France. By the way, if you're wondering, why did the United States have them? During World War II, all the combatants, fearful of losing the gold they had, moved it to the United States. And that's how we got it. Anyway, when Mr. de Gaulle did that, we were starting to lose our gold at an incredible clip. And what we then did was a sign that we had become the world empire. The president at that time, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971, went on radio and television and announced to an American public that didn't understand what he was talking about that we were no longer going to abide by the gold standard. Anybody in the world who had dollars and showed up at our doorstep wanting to cash it in would be told, you can cash in your dollars, but we're not giving you any more of our gold. All you will get for the dollar you give us is another one just like it. In other words, we went off the gold standard, and now the dollar was worth whatever you could get for it in the world economy. And this was a traumatic shift, and the Americans were very worried that the world would turn away from the United States one way or another, sooner or later. And so Mr. Kissinger, a smart man who I took courses with when I was an undergraduate, where he was teaching, and he and Mr. Nixon, and I'm being polite, is he, and then Nixon didn't understand it either. He went and he cut a deal with Saudi Arabia. Why? Because at that time, the Saudis were the number one source of oil in the world, and oil had, by that time, become the number one fuel in this country, replacing coal and before anything else could begin to compete with it. Oil was the future of the world. So much so that, for example, in 1953, because it's so pertinent now, the United States, the CIA, and MI6 in England overthrew the elected government of Iran because Iran was the second most important source of oil at that time. And Mr. Mossadegh wanted to develop it for Iranian purposes. We got rid of him and stuck in there the Shah of Iran, who was an American puppet, although I know it's polite to use other words, but that's what he was. Now, Mr. Kissinger said to the sheikhs of Arabia in Saudi Arabia, here's the deal we want. We're very worried about the dollar, and we need to make the dollar the global currency as befits our hegemonic social position. And you're going to help us do it. They asked politely, but the people in Saudi Arabia understood the implied threat. So here's the deal. All transactions buying or selling oil will henceforth be required to be paid for in US dollars. So consider a buyer of oil in somewhere in Africa who buys it from Saudi Arabia. That transaction has to be carried out and paid for in US dollars. Same thing anywhere, everywhere in the whole world, which the Saudis could make a reality because they were so dominant at that time. And later they could make OPEC do this as well.
So it
Okay,
was a brilliant idea, actually, because you need demand for any amount of securities or dollars or corporate debt, whatever you're making. You need a demand for it. I mean, the original problem that Alexander Hamilton had was there wasn't enough currency to go around, and so there was
right.
deflation. Right? Deflation is when there's too much demand for the currency in circulation. Inflation is when there's not enough demand for the currency in circulation. So they created demand for these dollars. It's brilliant. It was. I don't think the British ever came up, or any other reserve currency empire of the past ever came up with such a great idea. Those people, was it Burns and
Even if you're right, the way that idea developed was through the experiences of the British, the French, and the others managing their money. Mistakes taught people what not to do. But in any case, let me finish this story.
okay.
What this did was say, okay, now the whole world has to have dollars. As you put it, creating the demand for dollars on a global expanding scale. Very bold. You're quite right. Very creative. And the United States said to the Saudis, and later extended it to other Gulf states there where the oil was found, here's what we're going to do. You collect dollars because you have the oil, but you are a very poor country. You are a very small country, and there's really nothing you can do with those dollars. And here's what we suggest. You rake off a nice percentage for yourself off the top. In other words, you take a big bunch of those dollars and you can buy a chateau in the south of France where you can do all the things that your Islamic religion prohibits you from doing where you live. And I'm being facetious, but they became very, very wealthy. And who were they? Whoever the Americans designated the head of that part of the world, whatever tribal grouping they found willing to make this deal. The rest of all the dollars you collect for selling oil to the world, we want you to invest in the United States. You can do some of it buying shares of stock on the stock market. But most of all, what we want you to do as a model for the rest of the world is hold your dollars in the form of loans to the United States government. Because that way, the asset you're holding, the dollars, is earning you an income, the interest that the United States has to pay every year on its national debt. And that's what these countries have been doing. They all have what are called sovereign wealth funds. That's the funds holding the accumulation of dollars they get from selling oil. They live like the greatest royalty ever was, which they have become. Very, very lavish lifestyles if you follow them. And they hold ridiculous amounts of American stocks, bonds, and above all, the debt of the United States. And they collect dividends and interest, which adds to their wealth yet again. Some of you may know that entities like the New York Citibank, the largest, until recently at least, the largest shareholder in the Citibank is the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Things like that became normal. These things, these dollars that went abroad, ended up being used to buy oil, then came back to the United States, from which they were then sent abroad. Why? Because America imports huge amounts of goods and services from the rest of the world. That system came to be called the petrodollar because of its close intertwining between the money on the one hand and that particular commodity known as oil. By the way, that is all being disrupted now. And no one knows whether it will be recreated or not. That's why you're hearing speculation about the dollar, because, for example, earlier today it was announced that the third largest oil country in the world, the United Arab Emirates, quit OPEC today, this morning. Now, that's a very important breakdown of what had been a pretty solid group. UAE was part of OPEC for the last 50 years. So this just shows you how big a historical moment we are living through in this war with Iran. It's that war that forced this decision, and you'll see more of these kinds of changes coming as the ramifications of the war on Iran and the failure so far to defeat Iran, the consequences are just beginning to play themselves out.
Okay, so
Professor,
here's what the UAEs, and you bring that up. That's an interesting example of what's happening there. They're the ones, right, who just asked for a bailout, and so a month ago, 2 months ago, they were promising to put trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy in investments in AI and other things. Fast forward 6 weeks, they want a bailout. And what they've been doing, because you're right, when when you've got petrodollar, when you're a creditor of any country, you have two choices with the currency. You can or with your IOUs that you just got, you can sell them back, in which case your currency will go up in value and that currency will go down in value because you're creating demand for your own currency. Or you can hold them or buy assets in that country, right? Because that way you're selling them back to the country. So of course, what you're going to do as a creditor nation is invest in the countries that are your debtors, right? That's the only, other than getting your own currency back, that's all you can do. But what's happened in the UAE is because of all the infrastructure that's been ruined, and because their inability to sell oil anymore, they need liquidity. They've been selling treasuries, they've been selling gold, they've been selling US dollars, and now they want a bailout. So and I'm sure what happened there is the US said, hey, if you want to bail out, which they will do, they won't bail out Americans, but they'll bail out the UAE. And what they'll do is they'll say, fine, you want to bail out? Get out of OPEC and sell your oil to us, not at OPEC prices, right? Don't you think that's what happened there?
Yes, or they want them to do something vis-a-vis the war with Iran. Who knows? All that stuff is done in absolute secret.
Well, let
But
me ask you a question about currencies again. And, it's about the Russians, the Chinese. One of the things that happened in Iran is that the Iranians started saying, sure, we'll sell oil to you, whoever you are, as long as we settle in yuan, right? So we're not going to give the dollar this exorbitant advantage anymore. We're gonna use yuan or some other currency to settle in. What happens when other countries do that, number one? And number two, the BRICS have been talking about that for a long time. Why is it so hard for them to get out of the dollar system? I mean, Russia, China, Brazil, the other countries that are nominally in BRICS, they haven't found a good way to circumvent the US dollar economy yet. And why
well,
not?
well, let me respectfully disagree.
Okay.
It is the American media that likes to have the Chinese not able to do something. That's a big mistake. The Chinese are able to do it all, and I'm no great. I'm not a. I have no illusions about China. China has its problems. It's not an ideal society or anything like that. But you do have to face certain realities. The Chinese development over the last 40 years has no parallel in human history. They have come further in a shorter amount of time than anybody else on earth has achieved. And that they can now be at the highest levels of technology, having 40 years ago been among the poorest countries on the face of the earth, is an amazing achievement that none of us, and my specialties include economic development that works on these issues. None of us expected 40 years ago. None of us foresaw. None of us have given advice to any country that has done as well. China had no advice, got no help from the West because of their communist revolution, and they did it better. I mean, it's a sobering reality that you ignore only at your own um, cost. It's silly. We have to learn from them. That's the most important thing that we can do. And here,
Maybe that's why, because they didn't listen to us.
yes, I believe that. Actually, I believe that. But put that aside for a moment. Here's the reality. The Chinese, and I talk with Chinese economists, from time to time, and I have it from them as well. What the Chinese are doing is struggling with a contradiction. This enormous achievement that they made over the last 40 years, they made at a time when the global hegemon was the United States, when the global currency was the US dollar. They're not at all clear that that period is over. They don't want, if you allow me to exaggerate, they don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg with them. They got lots of benefits out of the dollar and the domination of the United States. Lots of them. And they're no rush at all. They've given advice to Iran to make a deal with Trump. They want that war over. They don't like it. They're afraid of where that could go, and all of that. Not at all the caricature. Will they help the Iranians? For sure. Are they already helping them? Absolutely. Although the major support for Iran, which we have to understand, even though it makes people uncomfortable, is Russia. Russia is helping Iran and is making the key difference. And if you need a geography lesson, take a look at the Caspian Sea. That is a waterway that connects Russia to Iran that nobody can interfere with. Anything produced in China can go to Russia without interference, and from there to Iran. So when you count missiles, don't count the missiles Iran still has, important though they may be. But the factory producing for Iran is Russia and China. And that's the greatest factory on this planet at this point, without any question. So it's very, very important. That's the reason the BRICS haven't come up. They can come up with their own currency. They've had, by the way, models. They've had a model of a particular country. mostly China, being the currency, the yuan, or a basket, a new currency that would be composed of a collection of some or even all of the BRICS countries. And number three, one kind of cryptocurrency that they might develop collectively and offer to the world. I think you're right. I think eventually they're going to move in that direction, but they are in no rush. But it's not because they can't do it or they don't have the ideas. They have just the same smart economists that we do. They can do all of that. They now have the financial institutions. They engage in global trade. All of that's taken care of. It's like always, it's a political question when they think the time is right. And my best reading of their situation is they're ambivalent and therefore they're not in a rush.
Professor, let me ask you a little bit about the effect of the war in Iran on the U.S. economy, because it seems, based on a lot of the things you and Patrick are talking about, first of all, the disruption to the dollar, the supremacy of the dollar, because Iran is insisting on payment in yuan for shipments, which apparently is quite threatening to the U.S. dollar. So that's one consequence of this war. Another consequence is just the disruption of commerce through the Strait of Hormuz, and not just oil, but fertilizer, other raw materials. And the third one is just the destruction of U.S. assets. I mean, I think we've been learning more in the last week about the destruction of our military bases in the Gulf,
Yeah.
and it's apparently far greater than we were led to believe. So my question is, really, the stock market has not reflected what it seems like we all are seeing, this disastrous situation. And part of it is maybe just that Trump is just such a good salesman and he's able to bluff the markets on Friday afternoon by saying, Iran's on their knees begging for a deal. We're in negotiations. They need it more than us. We can, we have no problems. Everything's great. We've destroyed all their missiles. None of that is true. At some point, a bluffer has to lay down their cards. So I'm wondering, what is the end game for the US market? What do you see coming in the future months? Is Trump just, is it, and then let's also, if you could throw in the blockade. I don't really understand how you blockade a strait since we can't go within 800 miles. Our ships can't go within 800 miles of the coast of Iran because their missiles will strike us. So I don't understand how you can blockade, but maybe it's brilliant. I don't know. Can you explain what's going on and the effect of this war and the effect of Trump's manipulation of the market? And is that a short-term gain, a sugar high, or is this some sort of grand strategy that I'm not picking up on?
Well, if it's a grand strategy, it has the best hidden grand strategy I have ever encountered in my life. No, I don't think it's a grand strategy. I think it is by the seat of your pants, desperately trying to do something now that you have learned, and remember, they know it sooner than we do. You have learned that a basic assumption underlying the decision to go to war was mistaken, was wrong, was not correct. And you can even see it in the intelligence officials, the generals who are leaking left and right in Washington, wanting people to know that they weren't so even Vice President Vance, leaking that they weren't so sure this was a good idea, that they said, don't do this, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the basic thing. The presumption of the United States and of Israel, and probably more of Israel than the United States. The presumption was that the government in Iran, having had enormous difficulties with its own people, particularly last year, very early this year, a country riven by all kinds of conflict, which it has been for a long time, that they were on the edge of
And U.S. sanctions for
yes,
some
suffering
30
all
years.
this
Yes.
U.S. sanctions and the 12-day war in June of last year and all of that, that they were on the edge of collapse, dissolution, internal revolution, breaking apart, all kinds of ideas like this. So that a strong, hard decapitation hit by the United States and Israel would simply bring us regime change, a new government, and one that would sue for peace and do what the United States and Israel wanted. Hopefully, even breaking up a country. Remember, geographically, it is very large. It has 92 million people. It is a colossus, particularly in that part of the world. That assumption was wrong. And whoever gets the blame, the intelligence agencies, the Israeli ones, the American ones, the British ones, I don't know. It's not my field. At best, a guess. But somebody was completely wrong. You went in there, you immediately killed, and this is a footnote, but for Americans, it's important to know. You immediately killed the man who is not only the political leader of the country, but the religious leader. Imagine if you had a president who was also the Pope. And imagine a Catholic population whose president was also the Pope. And you went in there and killed an 88 years old a fellow like that. You did that, you bombed the crap out of them, and then you realize you made an enormous mistake. They're not going to fold. They're not going to disintegrate. They have a much more developed military than you understood. They have protected it against you way beyond what you understood. They have a solid alliance with Russia, whose activity in the Ukraine war you should have learned more from than you did, etc., etc. And I think what we're seeing is the desperate, and I want that word underscored, the desperate effort of the United States, led by Mr. Trump, to find what I believe political scientists call an off ramp from this war, to get out of there before even more damage is done than the defeat. I mean, to be honest, that we have suffered. And remember, we were defeated in Vietnam, and we were defeated in Afghanistan. You know, the people in charge in Vietnam today are the Communist Party of North Vietnam. That was who we were fighting in that war. And the people who run Afghanistan today are the Taliban. Those were the people we were fighting. You can play games, but it's clear who won and who lost. We're about to lose a much bigger one. And that's because Vietnam and Afghanistan were among the poorest countries on earth. Iran has developed beyond that. It isn't that. It's a different kind of enemy. So I think we're trying to get out, and I don't think we know how, seizing the Strait of Hormuz, which I want to remind folks, the Iranians said they would do that if they were attacked again. But this should surprise nobody. But I want you to understand, two of the closest allies of the Iranians is the Hezbollah movement in Lebanon, fighting Israel right now, and the Houthis. And the Houthis that are in the north there, at the upper end of the Red Sea, are in a position to close the strait up there. If they do that, then the constriction of oil and gas and shipping gets worse by a significant amount. The estimate is roughly 20% of the world's oil and associated materials go through the Strait of Hormuz. And the estimate for the Strait of it that the Houthis control is about 12%. You're talking an enormous extra kick. And when will that happen? If the United States does anything in the way of escalation from where it is now, and where it is now is not having the results that anybody wants. If he's bringing more aircraft carriers in, if he's seriously Trump, I mean now, if he's seriously thinking of troops on the ground, they are going to escalate as well. That's what they have done, tit for tat, throughout the last 50 days. So it's clear where we stand. Mr. Trump has to get out of there. And the question is, well, there are two questions. How will his base, the MAGA community, for lack of a better term, how are they going to handle not only that he went and made a war, which is having effects, as we know, on Marjorie Taylor Greene and on Tucker Carlson and others already, but what is going to be the effect if the war is also a lost war, a war of defeat for the United States? That's
Well,
one.
I think, can we ask you the economic question there, which is what happens? There's about 13%, I think, net. What I've heard is 13% of the world's oil is gone. It's locked up in the Strait of Hormuz, not coming out. It hasn't come out for 6 weeks now. So what? Let's just start there. If let's say the war ends tomorrow, what happens when countries have burned through the reserves? Is the idea that they're just going to replace the reserves that they have now with new oil later, and there's no effect on the economy? And then what happens if this goes on for a while? When
Okay.
you lose 13, 20% of the world oil reserves, what's going to happen to island nations? What's going to happen in the United States?
Well, here we go. This is going to scare you, all right? It's always important to understand that a major shock like this has not is not even in its effect. It doesn't affect everybody equally. So, for example, a week ago, the in the Philippines, the work week and the school week and the office week was reduced from 5 days to 4 days to conserve oil because they can't get any. They are being affected because they were the most dependent on the oil from the Middle East, and there's none of it coming. They can't get it at any price. So, what are they going to do? They are cutting back 20% of their school days, 20% of their factory operations, 20% of their offices. Now, are they going to pay their workers that 20% or not? If they don't, that economy collapses. Well, but if they do, then not only will the companies not be profitable, they'll all go out of business. They don't work on a big margin in places like Philippines or Thailand, or for that matter, South Korea. Japan is in a complete chaos, and they're going to be desperate. Now, what are they going to do? Well, here's one example of what's going to happen, and this depends on how bad it gets, how long it lasts, who says chicken first. But the country with the greatest supply of oil on this planet now is Russia. And one question is, how is Russia going to use the fact that I just told you? What are they going to do? The country with the largest reserve of oil is China. The two of them are in a position that is extraordinary. And China is already a bigger manufacturer than the United States and Western Europe combined. So you have in one place dominant manufacturing, the single largest pool of oil, probably of natural gas. I'm not so sure about that. And the biggest reserves so that the Chinese prepared for this better than other countries. So that it's going to change the geopolitics. It's going to change global trade patterns. Meanwhile, I want to remind you, most of the AI investment that has been done so far was done under two conditions that ought to frighten you. Number one, an unresolved question. The financial press is full of this. An unresolved question whether the investment in AI is profitable given the savings on labor that it will or will not enable. The answer is we don't know. However, meanwhile, trillions of dollars have been borrowed from all the biggest banks in America to fund the building out of AI. That could become exactly like what happened in the early months of the year 2000 when we had what is called the dot-com crash, when all the hoopla of the 1990s about what computers could and would do went so far ahead of the realities that when those realities caught up, the stock market crashed. Okay, this is not an unusual story. We are in the middle of two things that are happening at the same time, which will scare you. And you should be scared. Number one, a techno bubble, which we don't know whether it is a bubble for sure or not. And at the same time that we may be knee deep in a techno bubble, we are knee deep in the decline of the American empire when our leaders need to pretend they think that's what politics requires, that we're not in a declining empire, which
How
only
long?
the
How
decline.
long can we? How long do you think we can stop? Continue pretending? A month? Well, right now, we've got these oil reserves,
Let
and
me answer your question, and my answer is a nod to your profession. If I'm not mistaken, the oldest quotation I know about is that the first casualty in every war is the truth. All right. All I can tell you is this one is a study in the veracity of that remark. We have been told, and by the way, I don't blame Mr. I don't like Mr. Trump. It's not the point. I don't think it's him. Or let's put it this way: if it's him as a result of a much larger social process. I assume it's difficult to admit your empire is over. It was very good, the 20th century, in taking us up the hill. Yeah, not everybody joined, and they certainly didn't join equally, but it was a good century. And indeed, when I came of age after World War II, I lived at a time when America was celebrated and American exceptionalism was the most thrilling idea my teachers could give us, and all of that. So I understand if you've been in that situation for the previous 75 odd years or longer, it's very hard to face it, to recognize it when you've peaked and when you're going down, because going down the hill is way less fun than going up. I appreciate it. I allow for it. But I do think, apropos your question, that it is becoming a luxury we cannot afford. The last presidential election that we all went through, neither Mr. Trump nor Mr. Biden nor Kamala Harris said a word about a declining empire. It would have been a taboo equivalent to anything else that was not mentioned because it's too dangerous. Well, we can't afford that. We are making mistakes. If I had to give a one sentence answer to the question, as I have been asked many times, why did they do this war on Iran now? Then my answer would be when you can't admit that your empire is declining, that you can no longer do what you used to do, that other parts of the world, having studied you, have come up with ways of doing what you used to do as well, or even better than you do, and that's the way the world works, that part of the reason they attacked Iran is they can't think like that. They can't ask those questions. They have around them, I guess, experts and sober minded people who, if asked that question, would have given them the same answer I would. I think those people are up there, even though we disagree on a lot of things. But I don't think in the moment, in the mentality, if you watch Mr. Trump or Mr. Hegseth or the others, it doesn't compute. They are still in charge of the number one country in the world. We're the most powerful. Uh, it's over that stuff. And it's just going to be very bad for the American people the longer this make believe continues.
Professor, this is something I've always wanted to ask you. I've known you for several years. You know, I think most people are understanding that there's real problems with our American capitalist system. Some people call it late stage capitalism, which is kind of what you're describing. But it's clear, I think most people understand that the system isn't working for ordinary people. Basically, our politicians represent their donors, and the
Yeah.
interests of the donors are not at all, they're really adversarial to the interests of the the 75% or the 80% or working people, however you want to describe it. Uh, they live in a different world. So, and there have been studies that have shown that the the wishes of the average voter mean nothing to Washington. So it's really not a democracy. Our interests have no influence on government. So there's clearly problems, and you, as a critic of capitalism, certainly have predicted a lot of these problems with late stage capitalism. But the question I want to ask you is, can capitalism be saved? Because we had a model back in the New Deal, and in this was, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, maybe he saved capitalism with this model, and it seemed to work for several decades. And we had regulated banks, we had regulated financial markets. When people were unemployed, the federal government would put them to work doing important projects, building parks, building bridges, paying them wages. Today, we don't do that. If the government's just everything's privatized, their cronies get rich, and whether people get jobs or not is sometimes it never happens the way it's predicted. There was also taxes, somewhat of a fair tax system where if you made income that you really couldn't spend in your lifetime, you were taxed on it. So is that model still a viable model, or what is the future for capitalism? We only have a few minutes left. It's a question I've always wanted to ask you. And
Well, let me start by agreeing with large parts of what you said. I do think it's fair to say that Franklin Roosevelt, under the pressure from below of the AFL, the CIO, and the socialist and communist movements of that time, which were very strong, Roosevelt, being a good politician, knew what they had accomplished. They had organized millions of Americans to push for what we would now call left-wing solutions. So I think it's fair to say that Mr. Roosevelt and that what they call the New Deal coalition did save capitalism. But the irony is, they saved capitalism, by the way, as they like to say, from itself, from its own tendencies not to do the very things you just said. And that requires me the logic of what I just said requires me to answer your question by saying, could capitalism save itself in that way again? And the answer seems to me, yes, it probably could. It would need a movement from below, which we don't have at this point, and it would need a cooperating leadership from above, which we likewise, in my judgment, do not have in power. There are a few people, but they don't have much power, neither individually nor collectively. So we lack what I think is necessary to undertake a saving of capitalism. But had we those ingredients, I think it could be done. And so if you like capitalism, I don't, but if you do, then yes, there's an opportunity to save it, but that opportunity is being missed. And let me say a word about that. If you want the very programs that Roosevelt and the New Deal coalition got, the creation of the Social Security system, the creation of unemployment compensation, the production of 15 million federal jobs, the ones you mentioned, given to an unemployed population, which transformed their life. If you want a minimum, the first minimum wage America had, all of those things were products of Roosevelt and the New Deal coalition during the 1930s. Well, you have to pay for them. And I want you to know how they were paid for. Taxes on corporations and the rich were raised dramatically. And the corporations and the rich were not happy about it. But Roosevelt, the job of the politician, split them. So half of them became inveterate haters of all of this, but the other half were won over by Roosevelt's argument. Gentlemen, he said, if you don't give me the money to do all these things, because it has to be you, since the country's bankrupt, you're the rich, you have it. If you don't give me the money, you risk not having any money to give anybody ever again. And they were frightened enough by the tone and the severity with which he made that point that the good politician prevailed. With the mass of people behind him and half of the ruling class, that was enough. And you got the New Deal. But when the war was over and Roosevelt dies, 1945, here's what you have. A business community in America, horrified by what they had just gone through, that no one prepared them for. No one prepared America for the Great Depression and what it might mean. No one. And so the business community, what did they see? A government that taxed them heavily, a government that intruded and intervened in the capitalist economy heavily, and did all that for the benefit of average people. This was for them anathema. And after the war, they made a solemn commitment to one another. And whatever you want to call it, it was rolling back the New Deal. Undo what had been done. Because, you know, the capstone of the 1930s, radical change inside America, was the decision of Roosevelt, let's remember, to ally with the Soviet Union in World War II. We had posters above the post office where you go and buy stamps of a Uncle Sam with his top hat, arm in arm with someone identified as Uncle Joe. That was Stalin, Uncle Joe, and everybody knew it. For the business community, this was the horror on top of all horrors. And they were committed. And so we had the McCarthy period, the witch hunts, the purges. Anybody who's a communist, you lose your job. Anybody who's a socialist, you explain they're just like communists, they just spell it differently. You hound all these people out. I became a college student while this was going on. I didn't know what was going on, but I learned real quickly what was okay to talk about and what wasn't. And so did everybody else in America learn that lesson, even if they didn't understand why it was happening. And we're still in that mode, the mode of rolling it back. And that's why we can't do the very things that worked last time. We can't do it because we won't do it. Not that it's not physically possible. It could be, it might be, and I don't predict the future any better than anybody else. But maybe in the fall we'll have an electoral event that will deprive Mr. Trump and the Republicans of control of the legislature, and then the Democrats will come in, and then the question will become, what kind of Democrat? Are you going to have Mr. Schumer? Then you're dead. Or are you going to have a new generation, more like Bernie or Ocasio-Cortez or those kind of people? They look to the New Deal, and so they might actually try to go in that direction. But the other ones, even though they lived through it, some of them, the older ones, they can't. They've made their adjustment, and they can't go back. I've asked them. I've had these conversations with them. No, they believe now in the market. Oh, and the last point, because you asked about it. Here's a statistic never to lose sight of. The 10% of the richest Americans own 80% of the shares, stocks, and bonds that are traded in the markets. Okay, so when you look at the stock market, you are looking at a part of the economy, but it's the top. And they are happy. And why are they happy? Because the prices of the shares keep going up. They can buy shares and sell them at a higher price, which is how the game is played. But now ask yourself with me, how is it possible if 90% of the people are having difficulties maintaining their standards of living, that there are 10% invested in the market who are watching their monthly statement of their portfolio rising? Well, here's the answer, and it goes back to the first question Patrick asked me. The U.S. government borrows money, and when it borrows money, it issues Treasury securities. And when the banks and insurance companies who buy most of those Treasury securities sell them to the Federal Reserve prints new money to pay for them. Okay, now the people who lent money to the government have cash. They bought a Treasury and they sold it to the Federal Reserve. They have fresh, new, minted money. Where do they put it? Well, those are the people in the top 10%. They're not the people who go out and buy another car. They already have 6. You know where they put the money? In the stock market. That's where the inflation from all the extra money, that's where it happened. And the people at the top are joyful that it happened there. That's the inflation they want. They don't call it inflation. They think they are whiz at investing. They're not. They have no idea what the companies are doing whose shares they buy and sell. And that's nobody's fault. That's the way the system works. The people who run the corporations don't want them to know, and they have no way of getting around that. So what we have seen is printing of money, going into the stock market, bidding it up, and making the top 10% not only very rich, but also oblivious to the condition of the other 90%, imagining that somehow they too must be participating. But they're not. They're not. That's why every poll will show you that the bottom 2/3 of this country are having a horrible time, think the economy sucks 12 ways to Sunday. But the people at the top, what's the problem? Mr. Trump has that Cupid doll that is his secretary, the press lady, Levitt. The stock market, in her high-pitched voice, the stock market. Okay, she's forgiven, right? No one trained her. Why should she know? But people who know, people who pay attention, that's it. That's why we don't have an inflation in terms of the potatoes and the other stuff, because it's all in the stock market doing its job of dumbing down the leadership of the country. They're not going to strain to solve the problem. They don't see the problem.
Well, Richard, that's probably a good place to end right where we started. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And there's a lot to unpack there. So we appreciate everything that you're doing to get the word out. And thanks for spending the time with us. It's a great hour.
Look, that's what I like to do. When I stopped teaching as a regular professor, I really couldn't stop the process. So I now do it in whatever other forums give me the opportunity. And I know of unfettered speech, and I know of the important work that you do. I really meant that when I said that the truth is very scarce. And even the truth that we know and can be confident needs to be talked about and put out there. And you're doing that. And so I'm as grateful for you as all your kind words about me.
Well, that's great. I should remind everyone to like and subscribe to this podcast.
Yes, please.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you.
and I hope you'll come back, Professor. We'd love to.
Absolutely. You want to do this again? Look, I like to, and you can tell from my style, I like doing this. So
Well, we like having you, so thank you.
I'm happy
right.
to.
We'll let you go. We kept you over, so we kept our producer over. So thanks everyone for
Thank you.
All right,
doing
take
it.
care.
Okay.